Tonight on Greater Boston, I'm Adam Reilly, in for Jim Browdy, as Canadian truckers and one famous tennis player fight vaccine mandates and many others push for a return to some kind of normal. Young kids are still waiting to get access to shots, and thousands of Americans are still dying from the virus every day. Two local doctors join me on all of that. Then later, the directors of the new FRONTLINE film, American Reckoning, which takes a look back at a black-led liberation movement in 1960s Mississippi and the still unsolved murder of NAACP leader Wallace Jackson. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has declared a state of emergency, invoking certain emergency powers for the first time in the country's history over the weeks-long trucker protests against vaccine mandates that have been blocking three major border crossings between Canada and the U.S.
Everything is on the table because this unlawful activity has to end.
This is 5 days and it's already taking a toll of tens of millions of dollars. And while people have the right to protest, they don't have a right to illegally block the largest land border crossing in North America.
But while those protesters have been fighting tooth and nail to avoid getting the vaccine, as is tennis great Novak Djokovic, who now says missing a few tournaments is a price he'd be willing to pay to avoid getting the shots, here in the U.S., many families are anxious to get their young children vaccinated. But despite predictions of a possible emergency approval of the Pfizer shot for kids 5 and under next month, the FDA is now saying they need more information to make their final decision, which the agency has pushed back to April at the earliest. So for young kids and their parents, it's more of the same.
They're going to continue to have to remain vigilant if they're concerned about the risk of infection.
Still, many others are itching to get back to normal or something approaching it, and dozens of Republicans in Congress are calling on President Biden to officially rescind the federal public health emergency declaration, writing in a letter, according to NPR, quote, "We call on your administration to do what so many states and other countries already have, accept that COVID-19 is endemic." But that may not mean quite what some people think. I'm joined now by Dr. Cassandra Pierre, Medical Director of Public Health Programs at Boston Medical Center, and Dr. Jeremy Faust, an emergency physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital and instructor at Harvard Medical School. Thank you both for being here. Cassandra, two questions for you off the bat. Is it correct to say that COVID has now become endemic? And if so, what does that mean in terms of how our response to COVID should shift?
It is not correct to say that here in the United States, at least, that COVID is endemic. COVID being endemic, or the endemic state, would imply that we have achieved a state in which COVID surges are predictable, potentially seasonal, and do not overwhelm our healthcare infrastructure and decimate our workforce. And as we can all attest to, we've lived through a period that has done just that. It is true that other countries have been able to experience, with the relaxation of restrictions, less upheavals in or surges in COVID-19 numbers. So when COVID-19 reaches endemicity or the endemic state in one area, doesn't necessarily mean that all areas sync up with that. And we are not in that state as of now. We are firmly in the pandemic.
Jeremy Faust, the epidemiologist Christian Anderson coined a phrase on Twitter recently, endemic delusion. And he defined endemic delusion as follows. The delusional belief that the pandemic is over and that we can get back to 2019 life by suppressing the fact that we need to keep innovating and fight the virus. Best exemplified, he said, by Denmark. And then he went on to cite a whole bunch of COVID metrics, including deaths that are going in the wrong direction, even though Denmark recently announced that COVID was no longer a threat to society. To your mind, is endemic delusion a problem here in the United States and elsewhere?
It's certainly becoming one, because if people have the mistaken belief that things are normal, then they will behave that way and they will soon understand the consequences of that. We just are in the tail end, I hope, of this Omicron wave, which was nothing like normal, nothing like endemic. We have in this state all-cause excess mortality. That means more deaths than usual, not just COVID deaths, more deaths than usual. We know what's driving that, it's COVID. So to say that things are back to normal would imply that the usual rate of hospitalizations and the usual rate of death that any jurisdiction can predictably expect, which is something that we've been tracking for a century. Endemic implies that we're back to normal. And the numbers are very clear. We are nowhere near normal. And if we think we're normal and we act accordingly, then we will pay the consequence for that.
I want to ask you about another tweet. You are the Twitter guest apparently today. This one is a tweet that you sent after a recent appearance on CNN in which you gently but firmly pushed back on the way they characterized your take on when you'll be ready to get your young child vaccinated. I think we have an image of the tweet here. Basically, they had said that you will absolutely not vaccinate your child until it's proven that the vaccine works, and you amended that to say, I absolutely will vaccinate my child when proven that it works. I want to make sure that you have a chance to explain the difference between those two takes. I think I get it, but I want to make sure I'm right. What is your position right now on when you'll be comfortable getting your child the vaccine, when it's approved for them?
Well, I'm really glad to talk about this because it's been an interesting few weeks. The FDA made the right decision and Pfizer made the right decision to not assess the data right now because, as I was saying, moving ahead with an authorization before we knew the dose that works for children under 5 was a very, very bad idea. And so that's what I meant when I said we would absolutely not do it, because we want to know that the dose we're giving our daughter is safe, which we know it already is based on what they've shown us, but also effective. So my strong language was actually kind of levied at a policy from the FDA and Pfizer that I rigorously disagreed with. But I actually wrote again recently to say, maybe I should have softened my language to reflect that tweet, to say, we will do it when. And I think so many parents want that. And in fact, we're going to have to do better than that, because for 5 and up, we have fantastic data to show that the vaccines are safe and efficacious, but the uptake is very, very low. So if we're going to proceed with a vaccine for under 5, we'd better have rock solid data that shows its benefit and its safety. I think we'll have that in the spring. I'm really optimistic, but I won't move forward without that. And I think a lot of parents would agree.
I want to underscore a gentle correction that you just provided. I said at the outset that we were looking at vaccine approval for kids 5 and under, that was still pending. In fact, kids 5 and up can currently get it. So I want to stress that. Cassandra, you have young children as well. What has your family's approach been when it comes to, or what will your family's approach be when it comes to them getting vaccinated?
So, it's kind of boring when people agree, but in this case, I do agree that we should wait in general for the general public to have good scientific data on efficacy and safety for children under the age of 5 before going ahead with the approval or authorization of the vaccine in this age group. That being said, I chose a different tack. I am a Black woman with Black children, and we know that children of color have been disproportionately impacted compared to children of other races and ethnicities by COVID-19 infections, hospitalizations, and even deaths. And I also have a child with an underlying health condition. I've also been a participant and am a participant in the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine trial. And so when an opportunity for my children to be enrolled right here at Boston Medical Center arose, I took it because I trusted safety. And the question for me was about efficacy. And so they are actually participants in the vaccine trial. I've followed it every step of the way, even prior to their enrollment in the older age group. The plan was when we were at the point of where the vaccines were approved and we were unblinded, we intended to get vaccinated if one of our children or both were not picked to be were not randomized to the vaccine arm. But that said, I felt it was important to, as a privilege, honestly, get them involved in the study, but also increase representation of children of color in the trial data.
I want to ask you both about what might happen when the vaccine is approved, assuming that it is, for kids who are under 5. Uptake so far in the youngest age group that can currently get it, the 5 to 11 age group, is not terrific here in Massachusetts. It's not that no one is getting the vaccine for their kids. I think 52% of kids aged 5 to 11 have gotten at least one COVID vaccine dose. I should mention, by the way, my younger child is 11. She has received 2 doses and will get a booster as soon as that is recommended for that age group. But for 12 to 15-year-old kids, it's 84%, and for all residents of the state, it's 87%. So I'm wondering what you two think in terms of how eager parents of very young children will be to actually get the vaccine for them when it becomes available. Jeremy, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Cassandra.
I think one thing that would help parents get to guess would be a better understanding of just how dangerous this virus is in comparison to other viruses that we routinely vaccinate against. There's this myth that it's just the flu, or maybe the flu is worse. And if you look head to head, we don't actually have to guess. We have mandatory reporting for pediatric flu deaths. We have mandatory reporting for COVID deaths. We know what flu does year in and year out. We now know what COVID's doing to kids. Since September in the United States, we've had, during the Delta period, I should say, we had 300 pediatric deaths in the United States from COVID-19. During flu season so far, we've had 5. So the burden of disease is 60 times more mortality from COVID than influenza in pediatric populations. I think parents want to hear that. All the things they get, measles, mumps, rubella, all these vaccinations that are routine or important, killed far fewer kids per year the year before those vaccines were rolled out than COVID is killing now. That we would have this unusually high standard for COVID vaccination, I think reflects the politics of the situation, but I think that parents will be moved in the right direction when they have the right context, which is that COVID-19 is a far more dangerous disease for children than anything else out there that we can vaccinate against.
Cassandra, do you think that conveying the message Jeremy just described will make parents of young kids say, okay, let's get as many doses as we can?
I think there are a couple of things. I think, yes, conveying the science is critical, but I think that science is not the only message, and we've seen that with prior older age groups in terms of messaging regarding science potentially not being enough. And I want to underscore the numbers that you just showed. The general numbers may obscure that there are even worse vaccination numbers in different subsets of the population, including by race and ethnicity, right? So even here in Boston, we have a 30 to 40% gap in vaccinating children of color, Black and Latinx children, compared to other races and ethnicities. And that's a huge gap. And as I just mentioned, those are the children that are going to suffer the majority of complications from COVID-19 relative to other kids in their age range. And so when people have spoken to parents of color in the past, in addition to wading through misinformation and disinformation and educating about science, the other issues that have come up have been access. And for many people in Massachusetts, we think we've handled access. We've put vaccines in retail pharmacies, in community embedded sites. We have mobile vaccination units. That being said, we know that many parents are working parents and they don't have time necessarily to take time off to get their own preventive medicine or that healthcare visits, or going to their children's pediatricians, which, as we know, are a preferred trusted messenger for vaccinations for our children. So I do think that in addition to science messaging, dispelling misinformation and disinformation, it's critical that we also look to access, which may be defined a little bit differently than what we were defining it earlier in the course of the vaccine rollout.
I want to close with a big question that we only have about a minute or a minute and a half to answer between the two of you. We have gotten through the Delta variant. We seem, Jeremy, as you said a moment ago, to be on the verge of, here in Massachusetts, getting through the Omicron variant. As we move ahead into whatever the next few months look like, should we collectively be bracing for, perhaps later in the year, perhaps next year, another variant that will come and hit us hard and make us look for drastic mitigation measures once again? Jeremy, why don't you take first crack at this? We'll give Cassandra the last word.
I think that variants are inevitable. I think our response to them is going to become more nimble and more tailor-made for each one. We're getting better at this. And I think each time it happens, we need to be willing to step it up. There's a lot of talk about de-escalation and mitigation, and I won't get into that, but what I will say is whatever happens, we need to be willing to put the heat back up on these measures quickly if needed. So if people decide to take off their mask, they have to understand the mask may have to come on in the future for a little while. If people are going about their business as usual for a little while, we have to say, look, in the future, you may have to stop that for just a little while. The idea is to do less, as little as possible, but as much as needed. And I think that that's the right sizing that we now can do and we could not do before.
I like that, Maxim. Cassandra, what do you think?
Yeah, I could not agree more. I would also say, in addition to thinking about the inevitability and the fact that we now have reservoirs of COVID-19 in animal populations as well that might also transmit variants back to us, is that we've been saying from the beginning, global vaccination is really critical and key to really dampening the effect or the frequency at which we are seeing these variants. There are countries in our own hemisphere, Haiti, where my family is from, with a vaccination rate, one dose received, 1.7% of the population.
Wow.
And that is very concerning, both for that country, but also for the world, right? In terms of the ability to continue having ongoing spread and transmission of virus that leads to mutations and variants that could potentially threaten ours. And so it's important that we move both towards better global vaccine equity, but also, as my colleague just said, ensuring that there are benchmarks in place and that people are aware they may have to go back into those mitigation measures when and if they are dropped.
All right, Cassandra Pierre, Jeremy Faust, thank you both for all of this. Appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
In the summer of 1965, a violent attack against a local NAACP leader inspired the black residents of Natchez, Mississippi to use armed resistance to defend themselves against local white supremacists. They also organized an economic boycott that won some big concessions from the city, but less than 2 years later, this fight claimed the life of NAACP leader Warless Jackson Sr., a 36-year-old father of 5, and 55 years later, his murder remains officially unsolved. Jackson's story, Natchez's fight for civil rights, and the largely unsuccessful federal push to solve cold-case racist murders are all featured in the new Frontline documentary, American Reckoning.
Living in Natchez, everything was separated. Blacks was on one side, whites was on the other side.
My mother and father tried to shield us from violence that was going on. A lot of violence was going on at that particular time.
Southwest Mississippi, Natchez and Concordia Parish in the 1960s were these sort of like this frontier region where people still lived by vigilantism and it had never been challenged. You had a huge Klan population in this area. And that's the way things were.
They were very quick to extreme violence. They felt very comfortable slaughtering people and knowing they could get away with it.
The film's co-directors and producers, Yoruba Richen and Brad Lichtenstein, join me now. Thank you both for being here. The film is incredibly powerful, and I'm happy I get a chance to ask you some questions about it. Yoruba, let me start with you. How does what happened in Natchez in the 1960s shift the narrative or complicate the narrative that we've become accustomed to about the way the civil rights movement worked?
Yeah, thank you for having us. I think what's so fascinating about this story is how the struggle, the Black freedom struggle that took place in Natchez during this time involved first off, we tell the story of the foot soldiers of the movement, and Warless was one of them. People that we don't normally hear about, who were on the ground working for change. And that's one way it complicates the narrative. These struggles were happening all over the country, all over the South. And we get to tell the story of one man. But it also complicates the narrative because the Warless worked with an organization called the Deacons for Defense, which was an armed Black resistance group, self-defense group that protected the community from the white terrorism, the Klan terrorism that was happening at the time. And they did not adhere to the strategy of, don't fight back. They had to fight back in order to survive and use, armed resistance to do that. And they also enforced a boycott that the Black citizens of Natchez had started against the white community to make demand for changes. And the Deacons enforced that boycott, and it was very successful. And they won their demands, and their boycott was actually modeled in other places across the state.
They, if I recall correctly, got everything they wanted. After initially being rebuffed, the boycott worked. And then we move on to the murder of Warless Jackson. Brad, one of the big questions posed by the film for me was whether this federal push to investigate cold case racist murders, more than 100 of them that started back in the late 2000s, whether that push was worth it, or if it wasn't worth it, whether it may even have done more harm than good. Where do you come down on that?
I'm not sure where I come down exactly, but I think you're right. You know, the cold case initiative was pushed by John Lewis when he was in Congress, the late Congressman John Lewis, who was really actually the motivator behind this film in the first place. It came out of a conversation with him. And, you know, the intention, as Mr. Lewis would say, was that if re-examining these cases could even just surface one person who had not until that time spoken, then, you know, that would have been worth it. But on the other hand, as you see in the film, the fact that there was so much attention, especially in 2008 when these cases were announced as part of the Emmett Till Act, it re-traumatizes some people as well, and that's very difficult. And then, you know, where we sit now, where there have been no indictments as a result of any of the re-examinations thus far. And there's not a lot of hope that there will, because cold cases are hard. It's been a long time. A lot of the perpetrators are dead. The perpetrator in Willis Jackson's case is dead. So, you know, I think you raise a lot of good issues. Just one note, you know, when Congressman Lewis introduced this legislation, he understood what was politically viable at that time. And what he really wanted to do was to have a truth and reconciliation process in this country, similar to South Africa, and to open the door to a conversation about reparations, which, you know, in 2008 was, well, my colleague Yoruba says fringe. It was fringe at the time. Today, we're actually having that conversation. We hope this film actually contributes to that.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Thank you for that. Yoruba, one of the things that made this film so riveting for me was the footage that you were able to use of everyday life that gave a real sense of what it might have felt like in Natchez in the mid-'60s. Let's show a little bit, about 30 seconds of that, and the narration here is from Wallace Jackson Jr.
This is a close-knit community here in Natchez. As a kid, family like with me and my sisters, the girls were kind of talkative and whatnot, and I could take so much, but I want to get out and ride around the street on my bicycle and see what's going on around town. We had horses, we had cows, we had goats. You know, of course, when we kill a hog or something, that everybody in the community got food, you know what I mean? And we shared like that out here.
Yoruba, how were you able to find footage this detailed and evocative? Because I haven't seen this sort of thing before.
Yeah, when I first saw this footage, I was pretty amazed. And Brad is actually the one who found that Wallace's story, that this story was in the film Black Natchez and subsequent outtakes of the that the filmmakers did after Wallace's funeral. Brad, do you want to say how you found out about this footage?
Sure. You know, when I first went down to Natchez, people in the community were telling me about this movie Black Natchez that I had to see. It was made by filmmakers Ed Pincus and David Newman, who are cinema verite, character-driven storytellers, much like Yoruba and I in a lot of the films we've made. And so they filmed Black Natchez in a way that, as you point out, is like so rich because it's so intimate, and they really camped out in the community. They spent 10 weeks there for Black Natchez, and we used lots and lots of outtakes. We only used about 4 minutes from the actual movie. And then shortly after Wallace Jackson was murdered, Ed Pincus returned to Natchez and filmed for a number of days. And so that footage had actually never been seen by anybody until this film came out.
It's mesmerizing to watch. And you have some comparable footage that's very troubling to watch of white Klan members and their families just kind of hanging out, having a good time, enjoying what they're doing, which is pretty chilling. Closing question for you, Yoruba. Toward the end of the film, we hear from Deborah Jackson Sylvester and Wallace Jackson Jr. about the impact that their father's murder had on the course of their lives. Let's take a look.
I actually had a hatred for white people for a long time. It's like I blamed every white person that I came in contact with.
It took my life down a different avenue. It's been real hard. But you move on, you persevere.
Yoruba, one of maybe the biggest question posed by the film is what a just American reckoning with our legacy of racism would look like. Do you have thoughts on what an effective, genuine, meaningful reckoning would be?
Yeah, I do. And I think it begs the question, or begs us to look at reparations and to start to repair the harm. That's what reparations is for, the meaning of it, to repair the harm that was done to these families. And this is very actionable, and it was not a long time ago. And so in addition to financial reparations, what are services that can be given to these families who are still dealing with this trauma every day? And so that's what I think could be a start. And the Truth and Reconciliation, where we have people come forward to tell their stories so these families are not left in the dark.
Did you have a sense when you were talking with these families, if there were to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, do you think they'd want to be a part of that, specifically Wallace Jackson, his family?
I think they would. I think they would. They want the story to get out. They are, very pleased that this story is airing and that their father's legacy is being honored.
All right, Yoruba, Richen, and Brad Lichtenstein, thank you both for talking this through. The film's terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Frontline and Retro Reports documentary American Reckoning premieres tonight at 10 here on GBH2 and online at pbs.org/frontline, YouTube, and in the PBS video app. That is it for tonight, but do come back tomorrow. Jim Browdy will be here with the new host of Morning Edition on 89.7 GBH, Paris Alston and Jeremy Siegel, on their new approach to the NPR mainstay here in Boston. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching.
New dawn.
New vibe.
New duo.
I'm looking forward to that, yeah.
Join me, Paris Alston.
And me, Jeremy Siegel.
For GBH's Morning Edition, with the local news and fresh insights you need.
To start your morning and inspire your day.
You know, you gotta live life on the edge a little bit. We're here weekdays from 5 to 10 on 89.7 and gbhnews.org.
All right.
We got it. Let's go. It's a new dawn.
See you in the morning.
Fridays at 7, we're diving deep into the local political stories that affect you and the world you live in. From the governor's race to Boston's new mayor and everything in between, we'll be talking politics every Friday at 7, right here on GBH2.